Tonight, we are going to travel slowly through the long story of ancient Rome. There is nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to remember. You can simply listen as the centuries drift by, like quiet lanterns passing along a distant road. Make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften. Allow the muscles around your eyes to relax, and take one slow, easy breath. Our journey will begin beside the River Tiber, when Rome was little more than a gathering of huts upon a few green hills. From there, we will watch a small settlement become a republic become an empire, and an empire leave its mark upon languages, cities, roads, and laws for thousands of years. The story is filled with famous names, but tonight there is no need to hurry toward them. We will move gently, following the quieter rhythm of everyday life. The sound of footsteps on stone, the murmur of fountains in shaded courtyards, the turning wheels of carts on distant roads, and the soft evening light settling over tiled roofs. So let the present moment fade into the background. And imagine that, far away beneath a wide Italian sky, the first lights of Rome are beginning to appear. Long before marble temples and crowded forums, the land around the Tiber was a place of forests, marshes, pasture, and low volcanic hills. The river curved through the landscape on its way toward the sea. It was not always calm. In winter, it could rise over its banks, leaving dark, fertile soil behind. Yet it was also a pathway. Traders, shepherds, farmers, and travelers could follow its waters through central Italy. Several peoples lived in this region. Latin-speaking communities occupied villages to the south and east. The Sabines lived among the hills. To the north were the Etruscans, whose prosperous towns, skilled metalworkers, religious customs, and engineers would strongly influence early Rome. Greek settlements flourished farther south along the coasts of Italy, connected to the wider Mediterranean world. Rome grew near a useful crossing point of the Tiber. The hills offered defensible ground, while the river connected inland routes with the sea. Geography did not guarantee greatness, but it gave the settlement room to trade, gather people, and expand. Later, Romans told a much more dramatic story about their beginning. According to legend, the twins Romulus and Remus were born into a royal family, but abandoned beside the river. A she-wolf found them and kept them alive until a shepherd carried them home. When the brothers became adults, they decided to establish a city near the place of their rescue. A quarrel followed. Remus died, and Romulus became the founder and first king of Rome. The traditional date for the founding was 753 years before the Common Era. The tale of the twins was never meant to be an ordinary record. It was a story about survival, rivalry, divine favor, and the difficult cost of power. The image of the she-wolf caring for the two children became one of Rome's most enduring symbols. Archaeology tells a quieter story. Small communities on the Roman hills gradually grew together. Huts clustered on high ground. Burial places lay between settlements. Over time, shared public spaces appeared, and the low valley that would become the Roman Forum was drained and developed. The Forum began as a meeting place between hills. In the early morning, mist may have lingered in the low ground. Farmers arrived with produce. Craftspeople displayed tools, pottery, cloth, and small ornaments. Elders discussed disputes. Priests watched for signs from the gods. The space slowly became the civic heart of Rome. Tradition remembered 7 kings ruling the early city. Some were described as warriors, others as lawgivers, builders, or religious organizers. It is difficult to separate memory from myth, but the royal period left lasting institutions. Romans believed that Numa Pompilius organized many of their sacred customs. Another king, Ancus Marcius, was associated with a bridge over the Tiber and the growth of trade toward the coast. Later rulers had Etruscan names and connections. Under them, Rome became more urban. Temples rose, public works expanded, and drainage channels made the valleys more usable. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great drainage system, began during this early age. Though altered many times, parts of it would continue carrying water beneath the city for centuries. It was practical, unglamorous work, yet it helped transform damp ground into streets and public squares. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, was remembered as proud and oppressive. Roman tradition said that his family's abuses drove leading citizens to remove the monarchy. Around 509 years before the Common Era, the kings were expelled. Whether events occurred exactly as later writers described them is uncertain. What mattered to the Romans was the lesson they drew from the story. They came to distrust the very title of king. In its place, they built a republic. The word republic came from the Latin phrase res publica, meaning the public matter or the common affair. Rome would no longer belong to one ruler. In principle, it belonged to the community of citizens. In practice, power remained concentrated among wealthy families. Yet the new system divided authority across several offices. 2 consuls were elected each year. Each could limit the other, and their short terms made it harder for one person to dominate permanently. A senate of experienced aristocrats guided policy, finance, religion, and foreign affairs. Assemblies of citizens voted for officials and on certain laws. The system was complicated by design. Romans valued precedent, negotiation, and the balance of competing offices. They also argued constantly over who counted, who could hold authority, and how the burdens of war and debt should be shared. The early republic was not a calm democracy. It was a society of ranks. The patricians claimed ancient family status and controlled many offices. The plebeians included a broad range of other citizens, from prosperous landowners to laborers and small farmers. Plebeians served in the army, worked the fields, produced goods, and paid debts, but they often lacked political protection. Over generations, they organized and demanded a greater voice. Roman memory called this long contest the conflict of the orders. At moments of crisis, plebeians were said to have withdrawn their labor and military service, gathering outside the city until concessions were made. New officials, called tribunes of the plebs, gained the power to defend citizens against abuse. Their persons were considered sacred, and they could block certain acts of government. The laws were eventually written down on bronze tablets known as the 12 Tables. The original tablets did not survive, but later Romans regarded them as the foundation of their legal tradition. Writing the rules did not make society equal, It did, however, reduce the ability of powerful judges to claim that the law was whatever they said it was. Over time, plebeians became eligible for high offices, and wealthy plebeian families joined the governing elite. The republic remained unequal, but its political community had widened. While Romans debated among themselves, they were also fighting their neighbors. Early Roman expansion was gradual and often uncertain. Armies were made largely of citizens who owned land. They left their farms during campaigning seasons, served under elected commanders, and returned home when they could. Rome formed alliances with nearby Latin communities. It fought the Aequi, the Volsci, the Etruscans, and the Samnites. Defeat was common enough to remain part of Roman memory. The city was even captured and sacked by a Gallic force in the early 4th century before the Common Era. Yet Rome repeatedly recovered. One of its great strengths was its ability to absorb outsiders. Defeated communities were not all treated in the same way. Some received forms of citizenship. Others became allies who kept local institutions while supplying soldiers. Roads and colonies connected new territories to Rome. The arrangement could be harsh and demanding, but it created a deep reserve of manpower and a network of communities with a stake, willing or unwilling, in Roman success. By the early 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. Roman roads became visible signs of this expansion. Surveyors traced remarkably direct routes across valleys and hills. Workers laid foundations of stone and gravel. Milestones marked distances. Soldiers could march quickly. Officials could carry messages, and merchants could move goods between towns. The roads also changed ordinary life. A traveler might pass farmhouses, shrines, inns, tombs, vineyards, and carts loaded with amphorae. At dusk, traffic slowed. Animals were watered. Lamps were lit in roadside buildings, and voices softened as the countryside grew dark. Italy brought Rome into contact with a much larger rival across the sea. Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, near modern Tunis. It was a wealthy maritime power with trading networks across the western Mediterranean. Rome and Carthage had once made treaties, but when both became involved in a conflict on the island of Sicily, competition turned into war. The struggles between them became known as the Punic Wars. At first, Rome had little experience in large naval campaigns. It built fleets, learned through loss, and adapted. The First War lasted more than 2 decades. In the end, Carthage gave up Sicily, which became Rome's first overseas province. A generation later, the Carthaginian commander Hannibal crossed from Spain, moved through the mountains, and entered Italy. His army won a series of astonishing victories. At Cannae, a large Roman force was surrounded and destroyed. For many states, such a defeat might have ended the war. Rome refused to surrender. Its alliances strained, but most held. Roman commanders avoided some direct battles, pressured Carthaginian support, and carried the conflict to other regions. Eventually, the Roman general Scipio invaded North Africa. Hannibal returned to defend Carthage and was defeated at Zama. Rome emerged as the strongest power in the western Mediterranean. A third and final war ended with the destruction of Carthage in 146 before the Common Era. In the same period, Roman forces defeated major Greek kingdoms and extended their influence eastward. Conquest brought wealth into Rome: silver, taxes, art, grain, and enslaved people. Generals celebrated triumphs, ceremonial processions through the city in which soldiers, captives, paintings, animals, and treasure moved before enormous crowds. Yet victory changed the Republic in unsettling ways. Long military service placed pressure on small farmers. Wealthy landowners assembled large estates. Enslaved labor expanded. Provincial commands offered governors opportunities for profit and corruption. Successful generals gained personal loyalty from soldiers and clients. Rome itself grew crowded. People arrived from across Italy and the Mediterranean. The city became a mixture of accents, religions, occupations, and social classes. Grand temples and basilicas stood near packed apartment buildings. Wealthy households gathered around quiet inner courtyards, while poorer residents climbed narrow stairways to rented rooms. The streets were busy and often noisy. Vendors called to customers. Bakers worked before dawn. Water carriers, builders, teachers, scribes, and craftspeople filled the neighborhoods. Carts were restricted during parts of the day, so heavy wheels sometimes passed at night. Even in the capital of a growing empire, sleep could be difficult to find. Public fountains supplied water. Baths offered washing, exercise, conversation, and warmth. Small shrines stood at crossroads. Citizens gathered for elections, trials, festivals, and games. The Republic's institutions had been created for a city-state. They now struggled to govern territories spread across the Mediterranean. In the late 2nd century before the Common Era, two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, proposed reforms. They tried to address the concentration of public land and the difficulties faced by poorer citizens. Their methods alarmed political opponents, and both brothers died in outbreaks of violence. Their deaths marked a change in Roman politics. Custom and compromise began to give way more often to intimidation and force. Military reforms and extended campaigns strengthened the relationship between soldiers and commanders. Gaius Marius, celebrated for victories in Africa and against northern invaders, became one of the age's dominant figures. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched an army on Rome itself, an act once almost unimaginable. Sulla won a civil war, took the office of dictator, and attempted to restore the Senate's authority through sweeping constitutional changes. He later retired voluntarily, but the boundary he had broken could not easily be rebuilt. Roman armies had entered Roman politics. In the following generation, three powerful men formed an informal alliance. They were Pompey, a famous general; Crassus, one of Rome's richest citizens; and Julius Caesar, an ambitious politician from an old patrician family. Caesar received command in Gaul, a broad region including much of modern France and Belgium. Over years of campaigning, he conquered enormous territories, wrote accounts of his victories, and built a devoted army. Crassus died during a failed campaign in the east. The alliance collapsed. Pompey moved closer to the Senate, while Caesar feared the loss of command would expose him to prosecution and political ruin. In 49 before the Common Era, Caesar led his troops across the Rubicon, a small river marking the boundary of his province. The act began another civil war. Pompey and many senators left Italy. Caesar followed, moving from campaign to campaign across the Mediterranean. Pompey was defeated and later died in Egypt. Caesar returned to Rome as the unmatched victor. He became dictator and introduced reforms. He adjusted the calendar, settled veterans, expanded the Senate, and began major building projects. The calendar created under his rule, with later revisions, shaped the one still used in much of the world today. Some Romans admired Caesar's energy and clemency. Others feared that the Republic was becoming a monarchy in all but name. When he accepted the title dictator for life, anxiety deepened. On the Ides of March in 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators killed Caesar during a meeting. They believed they were freeing the Republic. Instead, Rome entered another cycle of conflict. Caesar's will named his young great-nephew Octavian as his adopted son and heir. Octavian was only 18, but he proved patient, calculating, and remarkably resilient. He joined for a time with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's leading supporters, and Lepidus, another powerful commander. Together they defeated Caesar's assassins. Then the alliance divided the Roman world among its members and slowly fell apart. Antony formed a political and personal partnership with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Octavian used this relationship to portray his rival as a danger to Rome. Their forces met near Actium on the western coast of Greece in 31 before the Common Era. Octavian's commander Agrippa won the naval battle. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt, where they died the following year. Octavian stood alone, but he understood the fate of Julius Caesar. Romans still feared kingship, so Octavian did not openly announce a new monarchy. Instead, he presented himself as the restorer of peace and the Republic. In 27 before the Common Era, the Senate granted him the name Augustus, a title carrying a sense of dignity and sacred authority. Augustus kept the forms of republican government. Consuls were still elected. The Senate still met. Assemblies still existed. Yet Augustus held a unique combination of military command, political influence, wealth, and prestige. He was the first emperor, though the structure of his rule was carefully wrapped in older traditions. After decades of civil war, many Romans accepted the arrangement because it brought stability. Augustus reorganized the provinces and established a standing army with regular terms of service. He created a special guard near the capital and improved administration. He encouraged marriage and traditional religion, promoted literature, and filled Rome with monuments. Poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid wrote during his age. Virgil's Aeneid connected Rome's story to the legendary aftermath of the Trojan War. Its hero, Aeneas, carried family and sacred traditions through disaster toward a distant future in Italy. Augustus famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The phrase was an idealized boast, but the transformation was real. New temples, forums, arches, and public buildings reshaped the capital. Beyond Rome, local communities across the empire built in Roman styles while preserving their own customs. Latin spread widely in the West. Greek remained dominant in much of the East. Roman power did not erase regional identities. The empire was a mosaic held together by armies, taxes, roads, ports, law, and negotiation. The first 2 centuries of imperial rule are sometimes called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The phrase does not mean there was no war or oppression. Frontiers were contested, rebellions occurred, and conquest continued. But many provinces experienced long periods of relative stability. Trade flourished across remarkable distances. Grain sailed from Egypt and North Africa to feed large cities. Olive oil traveled in clay jars from Spain. Wine, glass, metalwork, pottery, textiles, spices, and luxury goods moved through ports and markets. Roman coins appeared far beyond the empire's formal borders. Ships crossed the Mediterranean whenever weather allowed. Sailors preferred the safer months of spring and summer. At harbors, such as Ostia, workers unloaded cargo while clerks recorded shipments. Warehouses stood near docks, and roads carried goods toward the capital. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant springs. Their channels descended along carefully measured gradients, sometimes underground, sometimes carried across valleys on high arches. The water fed fountains, baths, gardens, and private homes. Roman baths became some of the most distinctive spaces of urban life. Visitors moved through rooms of different temperatures. They exercised, talked business, listened to readings, or simply rested. Large imperial bath complexes included gardens and libraries. Their vaulted halls were decorated with stone, mosaics, and sculpture. The household remained the center of daily life. Wealthy Roman homes might contain an entrance hall, an open atrium, painted rooms, and a garden surrounded by columns. Wall paintings created imaginary views of architecture, landscapes, fruit, birds, and mythological scenes. Most city residents lived more modestly. Apartment buildings, called insulae, rose several floors above shops and workshops. The lower levels were usually more desirable. Upper rooms could be cramped, reached by steep stairs, and vulnerable to fire. In towns such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79, archaeologists found bakeries, taverns, election notices, gardens, household shrines, and messages scratched into walls. These traces make the Roman world feel close. People worried about work, supported candidates, joked with friends, repaired buildings, prepared meals, and decorated their rooms. Roman meals depended on status and region. Bread, porridge, olives, beans, vegetables, cheese, fruit, fish, and wine were common. The wealthy could host elaborate dinners reclining on couches, but the ordinary rhythm of food was far simpler. Markets followed the seasons. The smell of bread from neighborhood ovens drifted into narrow streets in the early morning. Families honored household gods and ancestors. Public religion involved festivals, sacrifices, vows, and ceremonies intended to maintain good relations between the community and the divine world. The Romans adopted and adapted deities from the peoples they encountered. Greek gods were identified with Roman ones. Isis from Egypt, Cybele from Anatolia, Mithras from the eastern frontiers, and many local gods found worshippers across the empire. The small Jewish province of Judea was also part of the Roman world. During the reign of Augustus's successor Tiberius, Jesus of Nazareth was executed under the authority of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. His followers formed communities that slowly spread through cities around the Mediterranean. At first, Christianity was one movement among many. Christians sometimes faced local hostility and periods of official persecution. partly because their refusal to honor traditional gods and the emperor's sacred status seemed to challenge civic unity. Yet the new religion continued to grow. The emperors who followed Augustus belonged to his extended family. Tiberius was an experienced administrator and commander, though later tradition portrayed his final years as suspicious and withdrawn. Caligula ruled only briefly and became remembered for cruelty and extravagance. Claudius surprised those who had underestimated him. His government expanded imperial administration, and Roman forces began the conquest of Britain. Nero came to power as a teenager. His reign began under advisors but became increasingly troubled. A great fire swept through Rome in the year 64. Ancient sources disagreed about responsibility, yet later stories fixed Nero in memory as an emperor more interested in performance than government. Rebellions brought his rule to an end. In the year 68, Nero died, and several generals competed for power. 4 emperors claimed the throne within a single year. The winner was Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty. Practical and experienced, he restored finances and stability. His family began construction of the great amphitheater, later called the Colosseum. The building rose in a valley previously occupied by part of Nero's enormous palace complex. Its placement carried a message. Land once reserved for an emperor's pleasure was being returned to public use. Tens of thousands of spectators could enter through numbered arches and corridors designed to move crowds efficiently. Seating reflected social rank. Games included animal displays, staged hunts, executions, and gladiatorial contests. These events could be brutal, but they were also carefully organized public rituals of status, generosity, and imperial power. Away from the arena, entertainment took many forms. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus inspired passionate loyalty to teams identified by colors. Theaters offered drama, comedy, and mime. Street performers drew smaller crowds. Dice, board games, conversation, and storytelling filled quieter hours. Vespasian's son, Titus, completed the Colosseum. His short reign included the eruption of Vesuvius. His brother Domitian ruled longer, strengthened frontier defenses, and managed the empire closely. But his relationship with the Senate deteriorated. He was killed in a palace conspiracy. The next era was later remembered as a high point of imperial government. Nerva, an elderly senator, took the throne and adopted the successful general Trajan as his heir. Adoption offered a way to select an experienced successor when an emperor had no suitable biological son. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent. His campaigns in Dacia, north of the Danube, were commemorated on a tall column in Rome. A carved spiral winds upward around it, showing soldiers building camps, crossing rivers, addressing units, and moving through mountain landscapes. Trajan also sponsored public works, harbors, roads, and support programs for children in parts of Italy. His forum became one of the most magnificent complexes in Rome. His successor, Hadrian, changed direction. Rather than holding every recent conquest, he consolidated the frontiers and traveled widely through the provinces. In northern Britain, soldiers built the long barrier known as Hadrian's Wall. It was not simply a solid line separating civilization from wilderness. It was a controlled military zone of forts, gates, roads, patrols, trade, and movement. Hadrian admired Greek culture and architecture. Near Rome, he created a vast villa filled with gardens, pools, libraries, dining rooms, and architectural memories of places he had visited. At the Pantheon in Rome, rebuilt during his reign, a huge concrete dome covered a circular interior. An open oculus at its center admitted a moving circle of daylight, and, when it rained, a soft fall of water onto the stone floor. Antoninus Pius followed Hadrian and presided over a generally stable reign. Then came Marcus Aurelius, remembered both as an emperor and a philosopher. Marcus wrote private reflections, now called the Meditations, while facing war, illness, and political responsibility. He reminded himself that fame disappears, that life is brief, and that a person should meet each moment with patience and integrity. His words have survived because they sound less like proclamations from a ruler and more like quiet notes written during difficult nights. Marcus ruled alongside Lucius Verus for a time, sharing imperial authority. Their reigns saw conflict on the eastern frontier and a devastating epidemic that spread through the empire. Later, Marcus spent years campaigning along the Danube. When he died, his son Commodus succeeded him. The choice ended the sequence of adopted emperors. Commodus preferred spectacle and associated himself with the hero Hercules. His assassination in the year 192 opened another struggle for the throne. The empire remained vast and wealthy, but the balance between army, emperor, senate, and provinces was becoming more fragile. Septimius Severus, a commander born in North Africa, emerged victorious from civil war. His dynasty relied heavily on the army. Soldiers received higher pay, while military influence over succession increased. In the year 212, the Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. Citizenship had once marked a limited community centered on Rome. It now extended across a world of many languages and traditions. Soon afterward, instability deepened. The middle of the 3rd century brought what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often elevated by armies and removed by rivals. Foreign invasions pressed several frontiers. Epidemics and economic disruption strained cities and trade. Parts of the empire temporarily broke away under regional rulers. Yet the Roman world did not simply collapse. Local government continued. Farmers planted crops. Merchants adapted their routes. Soldiers defended forts. Communities repaired walls and appealed to emperors for help. Aurelian, one of several capable military emperors, reunited much of the empire. He also began a new circuit of defensive walls around Rome. The old capital had grown for centuries without needing such protection. The walls were a sign of danger, but also of determination. At the end of the century, Diocletian created a more ambitious solution. He believed the empire was too large and its crises too numerous for one ruler to manage alone. He established a system later called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. 2 senior emperors and 2 junior colleagues governed different regions while presenting themselves as a united imperial college. New capitals near the frontiers became centers of government. Rome remained symbolically important, but emperors were now more often found in cities such as Nicomedia, Milan, Trier, and Sirmium. Diocletian reorganized provinces, taxes, the army, and administration. Imperial ceremony became more formal. The emperor was no longer presented merely as the first citizen. He appeared as a distant, sacred ruler, surrounded by elaborate court ritual. The tetrarchy reduced some pressures, but did not solve the problem of succession. After Diocletian retired, rival emperors again fought for control. The final victor was Constantine. Before a decisive battle near Rome in the year 312, Constantine later claimed to have received a divine sign connected with the Christian God. His forces won at the Milvian Bridge. The following year, Constantine and his colleague Licinius issued an agreement granting religious toleration. Christianity moved from a persecuted faith toward imperial favor. Constantine supported churches, involved himself in religious disputes, and called the Council of Nicaea to address disagreements among Christian leaders. He was baptized near the end of his life. Traditional religions continued for generations, but the spiritual landscape of the empire had changed. Constantine also founded a new imperial capital on the site of the Greek city Byzantium. Positioned beside the Bosporus, it stood between Europe and Asia and controlled important sea routes. The city was dedicated in the year 330 and became known as Constantinople. Rome was no longer the usual residence of emperors, yet it remained filled with memory. Visitors walked past monuments from different ages: Republican temples, Augustan forums, Flavian arches, great baths, columns, basilicas, and statues of rulers whose names were already fading. The empire itself increasingly developed Eastern and Western centers of power. Latin predominated in Western government, while Greek remained the great language of the East. Court politics, frontier pressures, and economic conditions differed from region to region. Later in the 4th century, the Emperor Theodosius ruled both halves for a brief time. Christianity became the empire's official religion, and traditional public cults lost state support. After Theodosius died in 395, authority was divided between his sons. The Western Empire faced especially difficult conditions. Powerful groups moved across the frontiers, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as refugees, allies, or soldiers seeking land and security. Roman armies themselves included people from many backgrounds. The line between Roman and non-Roman had never been simple, and it became even less so. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric entered and sacked Rome. The event shocked the Mediterranean world. The city was no longer the political center of the empire, but many people had believed its sacred history protected it. The sack was brief, and Rome continued, but the Western government lost control of more territories. Tax revenue declined. Commanders competed. Provinces in Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa followed different paths. In 455, Vandals from their kingdom in North Africa also entered Rome. Again, the city's monuments and population endured, though the symbolic damage was great. The final Western emperors held limited power, often under the influence of military leaders. In 476, a commander named Odoacer removed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial symbols to Constantinople. Later historians chose this moment as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. For people living through it, there was no single evening when Rome vanished. Local officials still used Roman titles. Laws remained in force. Landowners managed estates. Bishops organized communities. New kings ruled populations that still thought of themselves as Roman. In the East, the Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Its inhabitants called themselves Romans, though modern historians often use the name Byzantine Empire. Constantinople preserved Roman government, law, diplomacy, and imperial ceremony until the city's conquest in 1453. The Emperor Justinian, ruling in the 6th century, briefly recovered parts of the Western Mediterranean. More importantly, for later history, his officials collected and organized centuries of Roman law. The resulting works influenced legal systems far beyond the empire. Rome's legacy survived in quieter ways as well. Latin developed into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and other Romance languages. It remained a language of scholarship, religion, government, and science in Europe for centuries. Even English carries thousands of words shaped by Latin. Roman roads continued guiding travelers. Bridges remained in use. Aqueducts were repaired or imitated. City walls defined medieval neighborhoods. Temples became churches. Amphitheaters became homes, workshops, fortresses, or quarries. Ancient stones were reused in new buildings. Roman ideas about citizenship, contracts, property, courts, and public authority were studied and reinterpreted. The Republic inspired later thinkers, even though Rome itself had never offered political equality in the modern sense. Artists returned repeatedly to Roman architecture and stories. Builders copied columns, domes, arches, and monumental plans. Writers retold the lives of Caesar, Augustus, Cleopatra, Marcus Aurelius, and countless others. But perhaps the most enduring image of Rome is not any single emperor or battle. It is the city itself, layered through time. Imagine walking there in the late evening, long after the markets have closed. The heat of the day is leaving the stones. Water still moves through a fountain. A lamp glows behind a shutter. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the Colosseum rises in shadow. Beneath the streets are older streets. Beneath later churches are houses and temples. Columns stand where crowds once crossed the Forum. Fragments of inscriptions preserve names whose stories are otherwise lost. The Rome of the kings became the Rome of the Republic. The Republic became the center of an empire. The empire divided, transformed, and passed into other worlds. Yet each age carried pieces of the one before it. And now, as our journey reaches its end, there is no need to hold on to every place or date. You can let the names drift away. Romulus and Remus beside the river. The first senators gathering in the Forum. Citizens walking along new roads through the Italian hills. Merchant ships entering a sunlit harbor. Augustus watching marble buildings rise. Water flowing gently through distant aqueducts. The circle of daylight crossing the floor of the Pantheon. Marcus Aurelius writing a few quiet lines before sleep. Constantine looking east toward the waters of the Bosporus. And Rome itself, resting beneath the night sky. The streets grow still. The last footsteps disappear around a corner. The fountains continue their soft, unhurried rhythm. The centuries are far behind you now. There is nowhere else to travel tonight. Let your breathing remain slow and comfortable. Let the room around you become quiet. And as the ancient city fades into darkness, allow yourself to rest. The roads are empty, the lamps are dim, and the long story of Rome can continue, gently and peacefully inside your dreams.